Thank you, Ryan. And thank you all for coming. This is a pretty important talk to me. So, I'm Robin Arnott. I was the sound designer on Antichamber and on the Stanley Parable. I love those sounds, thank you. A few years ago, I've kind of taken my life in a different path. I've been designing this weird experience called Sound Self, which I'll be talking to you more about later on in the talk. But I found myself moving from, spending time with my indie game community, which I love, and also finding myself more and more deeply embedded in the consciousness hacking, transformative technology, neuroscience communities. And the endeavor, the exploration that's been really important to me over this last few years has been kind of a psychonautic endeavor. It's been, on the one hand, looking at neuroscience, looking at the ways we can hack consciousness, but on the other hand, deepening into a meditation practice, deepening into a less frequent psychedelic practice, and seeing what I learn about being from these explorations and how I can apply that stuff to game design. A few years ago, before his microtalk session, Rich Lamarchian said, "It's important for us to take inspiration from other games, but it's even more valuable to take inspiration from outside of games. The other arts, the sciences, and the natural world can all lead us towards new, marvelous, and beautiful types of game design." What I'm hoping to give you in this talk is a window into what I've seen, which is how these psychonaut practices, meditation in particular, can be rich fountains of inspiration for game design that I think radically change what it's possible to do with a game. So here's what we're going to talk about. Chapter 1, we're going to approach the topic of meditation and sit in silence for a minute or so. For those of you who don't have a meditation practice, don't worry, we can keep our game designer hats firmly on our head. We're going to be approaching meditation as a game. Chapter 2, we're going to investigate a model of understanding meditation and other psychological experiences that has radically transformed my understanding of what we can do with game design, and that's trance. This is the bulk of the talk. We'll be looking at trance and understanding it. Chapter 3, we're going to be going into the design of Sound Self and seeing how we can take our understanding of trance, or how I've taken my understanding of trance, to design something radical and weird. And chapter 4, we're just going to wrap up with some conclusions. And at the end here, I've printed, this is a pretty dense talk. There's a lot of stuff I'm fitting into this 30 minutes. So if you lose track or something, don't worry about it. I have some copies of a workbook up here I have for anybody who wants to take what you're learning in this talk deeper, and there will be a link at the end if you want to download that online. But that's going to take everything here and go way practical with it. All right, so without further ado, Chapter 1, in which we approach the topic of meditation and sit in silence for a minute or so. So please, let's all just close our eyes. Take a big breath in together. And a full exhalation. Really enjoy your breath. And push that last bit of breath out of your body. Again, big breath in. Full breath out. Part of what we're doing here is oxygenating your brain. Now, release control of your breath and just observe it. Notice the sensation of breathing. And when you notice your mind wandering, and your mind will wander because that is what minds do, just bring it back to the breath. Let's just keep doing this for a few seconds more. When your mind wanders, bring it back to the breath. So keep your eyes closed, please, and keep doing this for a little bit more while I talk. What is it we are doing right now? We're playing a game. This is a game with rules. Bring your attention back to your breath. What makes this game different from most of the games I think we talk about here is that playing this game interacts with our identity structures in some pretty radical ways. So please open your eyes. That was just a simple mindfulness meditation. Identity structures. So the self, as we experience ourself, as we think of ourself, I want you to see that you're doing this right now. You create ourselves. We create ourselves from our thought patterns. The way we think of ourselves radically changes the actions we take, what is possible. The habit of identity superficially emerges from self-reflectivity in our mind. And a mindfulness meditation, like what we just did, helps us become aware of fluctuations in the mind, like our identity, and disidentify with those fluctuations. And when we stop identifying with mental fluctuations, especially identity, there are some really exquisite states of consciousness available to us. And I got drawn into this discipline of trance design just simply because I thought mystical experiences were really cool. And I wanted to understand how our minds normally operating one way can access mystical experiences. And I wanted to be able to make these experiences more available to me and available to other people. So, a mystical experience. This is a great quote from Aldous Huxley speaking about an experience he had on mescaline. Visual impressions are greatly intensified, and the eye recovers some of the perceptual innocence of childhood when the sensum was not immediately and automatically subordinated to the concept. Interest in space is diminished, and interest in time falls almost to zero. In Catherine McLean's research on psilocybin, she found there were 6 characteristics that were very common in people's mystical experiences. Those are a sense of unity, that is, there's no me, there's no you, there's no world, there just is this one thing that is life. A perception, an intuitive sense that what we are experiencing is deeply true. If you ever hear somebody saying they had an experience that felt realer than real, this is what they're talking about. A quality of sacredness, especially for people approaching their practices or approaching their experience of mystery from a religious background. A positive mood. My favorite description I've heard of the positivity that comes in these experiences comes from Jill Bolt Taylor in her TED Talk, which I think is the most watched TED Talk on TED.com still, which is my stroke of insight. She describes, imagine dropping 40 years of baggage. What freedom. A quality of the transcendence of time and space. This is what Aldous Huxley was talking about in the last quote. And finally, a quality of ineffability. Ineffability means it's impossible to describe. So when Aldous Huxley said, when the sensum was not immediately and automatically subordinated to the concept, this is what he's talking about. Because we communicate with each other with concepts. And any experience that is not compressed into a concept necessarily cannot be shared through our normal modes of communication. So, if we can access these states of consciousness through drugs, through prayer, through meditation, can we do that with a video game? And I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody in this room that I think the answer is certainly yes. But in order to do so, I find it incredibly helpful to understand trance, because trance is the mechanism that will bring us there. Chapter 2, we use the wisdom of Dennis Weir's trance model to appreciate the multi-layered trances of a MOBA. So, what is a trance? I think we intuitively know what it means to be entranced. I wouldn't be surprised if everybody in this room is here because at some point, probably in our childhood, we were deeply entranced by a video game. For me, I remember playing Sonic the Hedgehog on my Game Gear when I was a kid and just falling into the loops of playing the early levels again and again. I was deeply entranced by Sonic. But what actually is that's happening? I think all of us here are experts in creating trance. More than anybody else in the world, I think game designers know how to entrance people. And I think it really behooves us to understand what it is we are doing. So, I find Dennis Weir's trance model really simple, easy to understand, and practicable. Dennis Weir says a trance is a self-perpetuating mental loop. So as soon as you have practiced something, like a game mechanic, so thoroughly that you are doing it automatically, you can be said to be entranced by that mechanic. And the thing with trances, the thing with simple trances like this, is that they tend to dissolve rather quickly. So in order to get a trance to hold us, take us deeper, we need not just a simple trance, not just a self-perpetuating mental loop, but a network of mutually reinforcing self-perpetuating mental loops. And the more mutually reinforcing self-perpetuating mental loops we have, the more complex the network is, the deeper the trance, the more stable the trance, the further that trance can take us. And complex trances like this naturally emerge from the meeting of game mechanics with human psychology. Elegantly intraconnected mechanics tend to give us access to elegantly intraconnected trances. So if this sounds a little bit like flow to you, which is a concept we really understand, I think, pretty well in game design, that we've pretty well internalized, that's because flow is a type of trance. But this pattern, these autonomous mental loops, also describe addiction, habit, meditation, and hypnosis. So this is the tool that I would like to help you guys add to your toolbox. So our typical sense of self, as we saw it earlier, that identity, is itself just a habit of the narrative mind. Let's look at MOBA. I think MOBAs, like League of Legends, create these really tremendously complex trances. They're fun to play. So what's that trance look like? And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. You don't need to worry about gathering exactly what's going on here, but I just kind of want to demonstrate how complex just a normal video games trance can get. So I think in a MOBA, our core trance is we're identifying with a team and working together to move forward, to progress together. And this is reinforced by our attention moving towards optimizing, every decision moving towards an ideal optimal. Our relationship with our hero, our relationship with the map, and it gets more complex. Our optimization loops are reinforced by every resource, and everything's a resource in this game. Health is a resource, time is a resource, even attention is a resource. And every skirmish we have reinforces our relationship with our hero, with our team, with all of our resources. So this is already becoming a pretty complex trance. But every single one of these loops, every single one of them, is itself reinforced by a deeper trance, a trance of paying attention. And this trance is a complex trance of our successes and failures. Our successes bring us into paying attention, reward us for attention because they feel so good. And when we fail, it hurts. It punishes us for not paying attention. There's time pressure. So every moment I'm not paying attention is a moment ceded to the opposing team. And there's this tension between what is known and what is unknown. So if we're not paying attention, we're going to miss things and not be able to use that information. And all of this creates for a really powerful attention trance that I think you'd be right to label as a flow trance. So like I said, every single one of these loops, and just have a look at this and I think you'll see how it happens. Every single one of these loops is reinforced by that deep and powerful complex trance. And this trance, and for games like this, for games as complex as a MOBA, become more complex as we get to learn the game, as we practice the game. So, I think a good MOBA is really activating us in our narrative mind. We're thinking, we're cooperating with other players, we're planning and executing on our plans. And so I like to say that the game meets us in this particular layer of our being. The game meets us, in this case, on our narrative mind. But to understand what makes a MOBA like this so entrancing, we need to go deeper than the narrative mind. And just as our identity, our sense of identity emerges as a trance from habits of self-reflectivity in our narrative mind, so too does the narrative mind itself emerge from the emotional body. The mind labels emotions, numbing them in a symbolic container so that we're not crippled by fear. And the mind also helps us understand the causes and effects of our emotions so that we can move intelligently towards the sources of positive emotions and away from the sources of negative emotions. So the MOBA is not only meeting us in our narrative mind, it's also strongly meeting us in our emotional body. I think that flow trance I drew out is really an emotional body trance. And activating people in the narrative mind and in the emotional body, I think that's something games do really well. I think that's something we know how to do incredibly well. So when a game like Journey comes along, they're building on a whole web of knowledge we already have, but they're bringing something novel they're bringing a novel trance into our emotional body. These attachment loops that when they executed them were just so powerful in Journey and felt so new too. So I want to go back and look at that game we played earlier when we closed our eyes, the mindfulness meditation. The core trance of this is focusing on our breath. It's supported by returning our attention to the breath when we notice that our attention is strayed, which requires the development of a quality of meta-attention. Now, this is not nearly as complex as a MOBA, which is, I think, why people get bored when they're learning meditation. It doesn't hold on to us like a video game can. But it's also a different kind of trance from a MOBA, and we're going to go into how. So the words we're using here to describe these trances, these are kind of attention words. These are words describing a sort of deeper layer of our being than the words we're using to describe the trances in a MOBA, which are much more action-heavy, action-oriented. And this is a fantastically complex trance. So if the mindfulness trance is operating on the domain of attention, then what even is attention? Attention is the highlighting and the feeding of certain aspects of our felt experience. So even thoughts, the content of your thoughts is certainly something that occurs in our narrative mind, that we experience as narrative mind, but you can feel the feeling of your thoughts. And this is a sense just like heat is a sense, just like smell is a sense, just like the sound of my voice. And that with thinking, with the qualia of thinking, actually kind of resembles, for most of us anyway, the qualia of voice, right? It feels like a voice in our head, which is kind of interesting. So what makes the meditation trance different is not only that it's occurring on this deeper layer of our experience, but from this deeper layer of experience, where the trance is embedded, that trance, in turn, affects the narrative mind by helping us becoming aware of it. And once we become aware of fluctuations in the narrative mind, the trance in our lower state of being can now affect the emotional body and calm down there, and so on. And this happens through play. We have a nice pretty map here. It's got those blue colors and everything. It just looks really nice, I think. But this is just a map, and actually exploring this stuff is done through the play of, for example, the meditation game. And I don't think meditation games are alone in doing this. I think we've seen some video games that also do this effect of acting from one layer to dissolve trances on another layer. So for example, Super Hexagon is one of my favorite examples of this. When you're playing Super Hexagon, its trances it's definitely not activating you in the narrative mind. It's definitely not activating you in your emotional body. It feels less like I'm playing Super Hexagon, and more like Super Hexagon's playing me. Did anybody else have this experience with Super Hexagon? Right? Like, there's something pretty crazy going on here. It's acting on a very deep layer of ourselves, and in doing so, it's actually working to kind of fuzz out our narrative mind. In a very different way, the Stanley Parable is activating us in our narrative mind. These are trances in the narrative mind. It's a story, we're thinking about it, but it ties our mind in knots, having an effect on our sensation of identity. It's kind of, I kind of think of the Stanley Parable as being a little bit like a digital Zen koan. So, where our mechanics meet, and stories, where our mechanics and stories meet the player in this massively complex trance we call the self, has a tremendous impact on the player's experience. But not only the player's experience, who they are. How our mechanics meet the player at any of these layers of self determines who the player is, who they are practicing being. And you can meet the player, for example, in the emotional body and have them practicing fear, or you can meet them in the emotional body and have them practicing compassion. If you meet them in the emotional body in such a way that it modifies existing trances, or habits in the other layers of their being, then you can effectively reprogram the narrative mind, or the higher layers of being. So I want to change my vocabulary here a little bit right now. I've been saying higher layers of being, lower layers of being. That's kind of confusing. Just these lower layers of being, I'm going to start describing them as more subtle. And these higher layers of being, I'll describe them as more superficial. They're no less real, but they're more superficial. So now's a really good moment, I think, for us to ask some questions about how we might use what we already know about trance here in our game designs. Who am I asking my player to practice being in my game? What structure of trances can continuously support that practice? How is my gameplay setting up and reinforcing these autonomous loops? And just as importantly, how is my gameplay or the player's existing habits interfering with the trance structure I'm trying to help them cultivate? A great example of this is if a player's existing habit of trying to control the world might interfere with a trance you're trying to give them of humility and surrender. And so I've got a workbook up here. For anybody who wants to go, I think I mentioned this earlier, but anybody who wants to go kind of deeper into this stuff, please come up afterwards, grab a workbook, and I've got a lot more questions like this in there. The upshot of all of this is that by understanding trance, video game designers have a unique skill set and a unique opportunity to design trances that are as complex and powerful as a MOBA, but operate on the pre-personal level of meditation to alter player consciousness temporarily and create a permanent psychological impact. In other words, we can create digital psychedelics. And I humbly offer the word, oh no, I'm not quite there yet. In 1990, Terence McKenna said, I love this quote, "The drugs of the future will be computers. The computers of the future will be drugs." And I think we're just beginning to taste how we can do that, just beginning to. And I humbly offer the word technodelics to describe these technological psychedelic experiences. And the rest of my talk is going to concern itself with the creation of technodelics, and specifically my technodelic sound self. Chapter 3, Recollections of the Trance Design of Sound Self. So, does everybody know this game? Most, and maybe all video games provide a structure for the player to project their sense of self into. My avatar is an extension, is sort of a container for me to project my sense of agency into. And meanwhile, part of the experience is defined as being not me, as being the environment, as being an enemy. And the funny thing is here, like the trick that the game designers are pulling off without even realizing it, is that the player is actually controlling the whole thing. If you jump, it's not that Mario jumps up, you're also pushing the world down. There's just this awesome trick that happens so naturally where the player projects their identity into your avatar. So wherever we, as game designers, use our mechanics or our stories to draw a boundary, we invite the player's existing habits of separation to see themselves reflected in that boundary. And I think there are really, really, really cool subversive ways to do this. It's sort of like a glove. Like if you see a glove and you intuitively know it fits on your hand and you try it on, you might try it on. If you see something that looks like a ham, you're less likely to try it on your hand. But we can design gloves that fit your hand really neatly, like Mario does, or we can design gloves that fit your hand in kind of an awkward way and make you practice a slightly altered way of being. And you could do that without going all the way into the sort of technodelic craziness I'm about to describe. So in Sound Self, I'm trying to do something entirely different. I'm trying to give a player that mystical experience, trying to give a player that sense beyond separation, that sense beyond feeling myself and against a background of otherness. So if you're watching someone play Sound Self, there's really doesn't seem to be that much going on. They're chanting with their voice and breathing, and they're observing the experience, and that's it. They just keep doing that. And I'm going to go ahead and try to play you guys a video of somebody playing Sound Self. So that's all it is. That's all they're doing. But what they're seeing is this. So it's entirely abstract, and we do that so that there's no images, no symbols there that you could just hang experience and identity on. Nothing you can decide is an avatar, nothing you can decide is meaningful. It's just abstract. All right, if you won't mind giving me just a moment to pull up my stuff. There we go. Oh, no. Sorry, guys. Here we go. Thank you for your patience. Oh, no. That's not what I wanted at all. Let's just get past these videos so it doesn't get confused. Here we go. There we go. And then I press this button. That gives me this thing here. There we go. Okay, thanks guys. So, like I said, what I'm trying to do for players is give them a mystical experience, which is an experience of the absence of our typical trances on these more superficial layers of our being. But I notice when I sit to meditate, if I sit in silence for a moment, before I can feel anything beneath my ego, anything beneath my mental fluctuations, I notice this pattern. It's a habit, maybe a habit, you could call it a habit of humaning. And this habit of humaning is a very powerful trance. And it's a powerful trance that, as far as I can tell, has 3 extremely powerful subtrances supporting it. Firstly, a habit of looking out and finding some things good and finding some things bad. This is just anxiety. Secondly, a habit of time, of imagining a future and a past. Like right now I'm sitting here and I'm worried about time because I don't want to run out of time and I want to give you guys all the interesting stuff, right? And this is what that feels like. And thirdly, a habit of sensing separation between, most I think, powerfully between self and other. And if this looks familiar to you, that's because this is exactly the same trance the MOBA was using to bring player attention into the experience. So a game can take these really powerful trances that we have ongoing in our experience and redirect that energy into a focus on gameplay. But that's not really available to me because I'm trying to disarm those very trances. So here are some counter trances that we're using in SoundSelf to try to dissolve these habits. For the habit of separating, for the habit of being anxious, you just relax somebody. If you just relax somebody, they're gonna find themselves less anxious. For the habit of seeing time, by bringing the player's attention into the present, by witnessing the beauty of what's here, we help them just not worry about time. And the habit of seeing separation is trickier. For that, what we're trying to do in SoundSelf is take the existing experience of identity, the existing experience of selfness, and redirect that experience from being just in here to including everything I hear and see in the game. So here's what that looks like as SoundSelf's trance. And our voice mechanic really powerfully supports each of these 3 counter trances. Firstly, by having the player practice a yogic quality of breathing, by having them chant and then breathe in, they're slowing down their body, which naturally calms down the physiology, naturally makes people feel less anxious. By having the player appreciate the present moment, by having the player chant, that voice is felt here in the present moment. You know, you feel it right here, and as long as you're paying attention to your voice, you're paying attention to what you're hearing, you're here. And finally, we're doing this really weird thing in SoundSelf where once you begin chanting, there are these sounds, the instruments of the game harmonize with your voice. So this sense of identity that you already feel
with your voice, with that vibration in your chest, you now associate that quality of me-ness to everything you're hearing, if you're relaxed enough. And then, by creating a synesthetic relationship between everything you're hearing and everything you're seeing on the screen or in the VR experience, we further extend that sense of self, that sense of identity, to include the visuals. So we have this synesthetic connection that draws us from our sense of self as felt as vibration in our chest through what we're hearing, through what we're seeing. So there's a lot more going on in sound self. But I don't want to go into all of that right now. I just want to show you this to show you, this is a trance that is as powerful as most video game trances. And that gives it a kind of a leg up on meditation trances, because we can use the electronic medium to help sustain much more complex trances. All right, so how does sound self fit into this? Well, I think sound self's trances are occurring on this really deep layer of our being, even below the distinguished senses, because we are affecting the way we experience our distinguished senses in this synesthetic way. So if sound self's activating a trance on this beneath our distinguished senses, beneath our sense of sight and sound and so on, and in our just raw, uninterpreted sensation, it is doing so in a way that numbs the narrative mind, that quietens the narrative mind, with lots of weird techniques, like we're strobing at them, we're using binaural beats, just loud sounds so that the player can't hear themselves think. We're using that trance to change the way that the player usually experiences their distinguished senses. And we're also doing something, though I can't pretend to understand what, we're also doing something in the emotional body. Because often I see people come out of sound self, and this is a totally abstract experience, and they're crying, and that's baffling to me. So I don't know what we're doing exactly, but we shake up something in the emotional body, and it's worth pointing out. All right. The big difference between sound self and I think the big difference between what we can do with technodelics and meditation, though, is that sound self is holding the trance in place. It's not teaching you how to feel into these deep layers of your being. It's just kind of numbing everything with brute force so that you're put there. Whereas a meditation practice gradually teaches you to guide yourself into experiencing our deeper layers of being. So I think this makes sound self a lot more like a psychedelic than like a meditation practice. And I think that's an important distinction. And there are many, many, many more layers of self that have been explored. There are many more models, but this is as far as I'm going. And if we draw inspiration from meditation techniques that activate us on these very deep layers, then I think we can potentially make video game trances and technodelic trances that activate us on those deep layers. So does it work? Does sound self work? From talking to people after playing it, we often see people describe a sense of unity. We often see people describe positive mood, transcendence of time and space, ineffability. I almost never hear people describe an intuitive sense of deep truth or quality of sacredness. But I think this is great, I think this is really early technology, and it gives me a lot of hope that it's giving people even this much, that it's giving people something even this close to the kind of experience you might get on LSD. And I think with just a few more years of experiments, a few more projects trying to do something like this, we'll get more of a sense of the successes and failures, what works, what doesn't, and we'll be able to activate this experience of intuitive deep truth, this quality of sacredness. So finally, and thank you all for your patience. This has been we've gone a little over 30 minutes, but I've got some conclusions. Firstly, game design is an extremely potent form for healing and self-transcendence. But unfortunately, most healers are really shitty game designers, and most game designers are not interested in healing. If you want to use trance, but you're not interested in technodelic design, like I am, there are a couple of things you could do, and I go into a lot of stuff like that in this workbook, but there's a few things you can do really easily just to give them a powerful experience. And I think one of those things is bringing the player's attention back to the present moment. If your mechanics, if the trance you lay in the player draws them continuously back to the present moment, you're doing a real kindness for them. And if you find existing trances and either disable them, subvert them, or incite them in novel ways, I think you're also doing something really awesome for them. This is that glove metaphor. What we can design is a direct extension of who we are. So if you want to design new, radical, different things, you have to become aware of the trances you're carrying with you, because those trances are encoding themselves in your game designs already. And I think two easy ways just to try on different trances, try different meditation techniques, try different stories. These things all program us in different ways and expose us to new trances. And there are plenty of meditation techniques that just help us become aware of the trances we've been carrying with us for our whole lives. Please come up here and take one of these workbooks if you're interested, but if not, on the next page I've got a little link for it. And finally, trance is a really, 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 really powerful form, so please just be kind. Here's some resources. For anybody who's interested in learning more about this stuff or finding a community of people who are using technology to alter consciousness, tomorrow night there's a consciousness hacking meetup group. I'll be there. I'd love to see you here. Thank you very much.